The business news now. Agricultural produce estimates in the country are said to be revised lower as South Africa's summer crop battles bad weather. Sentiment has moved from bearish as dry conditions have hampered the optimism expressed since El Niño struck. That's as rainfall has been merely average, and estimates now stand at a projected produce of 14.3 million tons. ESG and climate investment analyst at Standard Bank, Dr Penny Byrne, discusses this with us. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Byrne. What does lower crop estimates mean for the South African market, and how would the import side of this be affected?
Good evening. Thanks so much for having me. So we are actually currently expecting that we may see a further downward revision in the current crop estimates. So given the current estimates, we would have enough for local consumption and some to export into other markets. But unfortunately, the dry spell that affected most of our maize growing region across the month of February and into March was really devastating for the crop, and we are expecting to see even lower yields than the current estimate has got. So there's a chance that South Africa is going to have to import white maize in particular, as the western half of the maize belt was worse affected than the eastern half, and that's where most of the white maize is grown. And also there isn't as much white maize in the global market as there is yellow. When we speak about corn, we're talking about yellow maize. But white maize is what a lot of consumers in South Africa prefer when they're eating millipap. So there may be a need for us to import some white maize this season.
And on that note, I mean, white maize, Dr. Byrne, is a staple in this country, as you've rightly indicated. How does this reflect in terms of food prices where maize is concerned when we factor in the estimates that are far lower than what was initially projected?
Yes, so it's been, the season has given us such whiplash. We started out incredibly bearish because we knew it was going to be an El Niño, which tends to bring dry conditions across the country. And then the rain came out about average and the crop was looking beautiful. So we suddenly were quite optimistic. And then, as I mentioned, this really late dry spell that affected the region has given us a bit of a negative outlook once again. In terms of the pricing outlook, there's about a 3 to 6 month delay between very high SAFEX prices, that's the market price, in terms of the market price feeding through into shelf prices. There's about a 3 to 6 month delay. So there's still some time before we could see shelf prices for white maize, for millennial go up. And so there's still a little bit of a lag there to wait for. And then in terms of food inflation, a lot of the other stresses on food inflation are less strained this year. So things like vegetables were under quite a lot of strain last year because of load shedding, but this year that outlook has been quite a lot better. So vegetable prices aren't quite as high. Meat prices have also been coming off slightly. So the only real stressor into food inflation would be white maize, because it does feed through, but it's quite a small part of the basket if you just look at that one commodity. So it will, unfortunately, probably push food inflation a bit higher than initial estimates earlier this year might have projected. But it's not going to have a devastating impact. We're not going to see food inflation numbers like we saw 2 years ago.
Lastly, and on a broader scale, with regards to the ESG agenda globally, what's to be said about most of the weather patterns that we are seeing, even at a domestic level, being part of global warming, a topic that is a little bit still uncomfortable to navigate, especially because there are denialists out there, but at the same time there are those who are of the view that we are not quite at the point of disaster.
Yes, so 2023 was the warmest year on record by astonishing margins. It's as a climate scientist, we're really running out of language to adequately portray just how extreme what we're seeing lately is. And we've just seen March. We haven't got the March data yet, but it's likely to have been the hottest March ever recorded, and that'll make it the 10th consecutive month of record-breaking temperatures. So this year's also off to a hot start. As you say, there are plenty of deniers out there, but the rhetoric has changed. So rather than the deniers saying global warming is not happening, they're rather saying that the solutions aren't working or won't work, and that we need to still burn more fossil fuels and continue as we are, and that renewables can't take up the slack. So it's been interesting to see that rhetoric change, because it's very, very hard to argue that the climate's not warming under the current circumstances where they so clearly are. And yes, we've been seeing extreme events as a result of this across the world. floods and droughts and wildfires and more intense storms as well. And that's having a really negative impact on many regions around the world. So that's getting very difficult to ignore. And unfortunately, if we continue to increase our emissions, then the global warming is just going to get higher, and with that comes disproportionately more negative impact on the global climate.
Thank you so much for your input. Dr. Penny Byrne is an ESG investment analyst at Standard Bank, talking to us about those crop estimates going lower and lower.